Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. Thank you for joining us again. Chris, how are you doing this week?
Doing okay, thanks, Jake. A little bit of a cold, but it's not actually showing through in the voice today. So I was quite worried yesterday. I was thinking that today I would be croaky, but actually it's not too bad.
I'll tell it all. And you've released a second episode on your other podcast. Do you want to just briefly tell people, if they're not aware of that, what that's all about?
Yeah, so started a new podcast on athletic training with Rob Malseri. It's called High Performance Physiology. It's a pretty short podcast, again, weekly, maybe 30, 40 minutes, just talking about one particular important physiological concept and then relating that to training. And Rob gives some great examples every time about how he's implementing those ideas in his training programs for his clients. So I think it's a nice way to, kind of link the physiology with the actual strength training practices. And last week, we talked about maximum strength. We literally have just recorded a third episode on maximum speed and how to train for that and what the adaptations are. And we'll release that in a couple of days' time. So if you're not listening to High Performance Physiology, please do check that out. It's linked in my Instagram bio if you want to look at that. It'd be great to get your feedback on that.
You are becoming a professional podcaster.
A professional podcaster. Yeah, I don't think so. I think I'll only probably do podcasts with people that I know. But yeah, no, it's fun to talk through these things. But hopefully, as I was just explaining there, and obviously tying into what we do, I think one of the coolest things is to see how the physiology can be translated into practical applications. Because I think that's the big thing that I'm excited to see happen over the next few years in our industry is people using that physiology to inform their own training programs and come up with creative ideas.
And you've got one more thing coming up in, I think, a few weeks. Do you want to mention that?
I think it's going to be 2 weeks. I'm going to do a webinar with a friend of mine that, we're going to talk about preserving muscle mass during diets. That's something that, again, is, I think, going to become a hot topic in our industry over the next couple of years as people get into that sort of understanding of what's going on physiologically. So I don't want to say any more because I can maybe give full details next time we run this podcast because that'll be just before the webinar happens. But yes, in about 2 weeks' time, I will be doing a webinar on preserving muscle mass during dieting. Some very exciting stuff to talk about on that webinar. And I think a lot of it will be new to many people who hear it for the first time. So I'm excited to hear about that, but I will give more details next week.
So that includes like how to sign up. You'll have info like that next week.
The sign-up links will be linked probably from my bio or in a pinned post or something like that. But yes, I can give, again, full details of that next weekend.
Happy days. Let's jump into today's topic. Now, the plan I'm going to talk about is going to give it away. So I'm just going to unleash and tell you all what it is. And we're going to be talking about specifically how someone might need to train differently as they age. Okay, so what's different from a hypertrophy perspective when someone does get older? And there's some really interesting stuff that you're going to cover in a moment. But I'm going to talk about how the silver era solve this issue and what they suggested doing. So we're going to cover a plan from Peary Rader. We talked about Peary a few times. So obviously he was the founder of Iron Man magazine, which, this was mid-30s, I believe, 1936, something like that. And then he was the head of Iron Man for about half a decade, half a century. I think Iron Man still exists, but obviously it's changed hands. But obviously he was very influential in popularizing a lot of, I guess you could say, like bodybuilding systems and stuff like the breathing squats. He didn't invent them, but he was one of the key figures that was actually putting out some of this content. So in one of his books, he actually has a section on how to train as one gets older. Now, he's sort of a little bit, I guess, how would you say, flexible with what would constitute older age. So he says some men might feel old when they hit 40 or 50. For some people, it might be older than that, but it's kind of subjective. When you feel you're getting old, you feel like you can't recover and you can't perform the way you did when you were younger. These are some things that you can do. Now, just to be upfront, he didn't write out a specific plan. What he did is he said, this is how you should change your plan compared to the younger individual, compared to how you were training. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what those guidelines are, and then I'm going to take one of his standard plans and I'm going to tell you what that would look like with these guidelines. So the guidelines were that for an older individual, you should look at doing lower repetitions. So as an example, he said if you were doing 10 then an older individual should be looking at doing 7 to 8. He also suggested fewer sets. That will depend on if a muscle is a high priority or a specialization muscle, or if it's a low priority. And he did sort of give a bit of a distinction there, but he said you're probably not going to want to do more than 3 to 4 sets maximum per muscle. In general, for general health and wellness, he said 1 set per exercise or per muscle was sort of his recommendation for an older individual. He also suggested taking longer rest periods between sets. And an interesting addition, and maybe we'll touch on this. I don't know if we'll touch on this now, or maybe you'll get to it when you do your part. But he did say for older individuals, it's actually beneficial to add in a speed type exercise occasionally. And he didn't specifically say what type of exercise, but he just said something that's more speed related. Adding that in can have benefit. And like I said, I'm sure you'll touch on that in a little bit. So if we were to look at how this actually would be presented in a plan, this would look like, this is coming from his standard squat plan, because he was a big believer in breathing squats, and that formed the foundation of a lot of his plans. And this could look like the first exercise being a barbell overhead press. Now, this would be done for a single set, and it would be done for 7 to 8 repetitions. Then we could go into a barbell curl, again, single set, 7 to 8 repetitions, into a barbell bench or supine press, what they called it back then, for a single set of 7 to 8 repetitions, into a bent over barbell row. Now, he typically programmed this in the transverse plane, and this would be for 1 set of 7 to 8, and then finishing with a barbell squat. Now, like I mentioned a moment ago, he was a big advocate for the 20 rep squats or breathing squats, and he did say that for people who had lower recovery or lower capacity, or, that would include older individuals, that what you could do instead of doing a single set of 20 was to do 2 sets of 10. So in this situation, 2 sets of 10 for the barbell squat would be more suitable. Now, that's 5 exercises. He did say that individuals who are older maybe can do, up to, say, I think he suggested up to about 7 to 8 exercises in total would be their probably limit. But he said, anywhere between that sort of 5 to 7 is probably going to be suitable for an older individual, compared to, say, 10 to 12 exercises for a younger adult. So I'm interested not only in your feedback on this plan, but also how this ties in or does or doesn't tie into what you're going to share a little bit later on. I think that'll be quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting stuff here. I mean, just starting with the obviously we've got a reasonable kind of starting point for a program with those 5 exercises. Obviously, there's a lot missing, but it does kind of cover, kind of most of the. I'm hesitating because it, kind of like straight away I'm looking at what was not there. It's like, there's obviously no really good lat exercise there. We've got no hamstrings exercise there. And I'm not a huge fan of scapular plane stuff because it doesn't really do anything well. I'm guessing that's kind of maybe just a variation thing, and that most of the time we'd probably be working in the frontal plane. But it's not a horrible kind of starting point for a barbell based training program by any means. The stuff relating to the older people, I think, though, is fascinating. I mean, there's so much here that is exactly what I would expect, I mean, one of the first things that, you've written down in the notes and you've explained is this idea of dropping down to fewer repetitions per set. I mean, most of the time when we look at the fitness industry, people are tending to push older people towards using lighter loads because they think that, that's less damaging, that's less potential for injury. Sure, if you're working with barbells, then no, I don't necessarily think that it's a great idea to start encouraging people to use heavy barbells at that age. But that's a safety issue really rather than a physiology issue. I think physiologically, heavier loads are going to give us less intra-workout fatigue and also less post-workout fatigue. So, given what we're going to talk about shortly, that's a really, really good thing to do. So the fact that he's spotted that heavy loads are actually going to be better, with fewer repetitions per set, and be better for the older person than lighter loads, I think is really, really, really valuable insight. Same thing really would go with the other variables. So fewer sets. Again, we'll talk about this in detail, but the idea of not creating as much intra-workout fatigue by doing too much volume and not creating as much post-workout fatigue by doing as much volume, again, I think is going to be a factor that really benefits the older person. Longer rest periods, same thing. It's like just allowing that full recovery to take place between sets is going to make a difference to anybody's strength training performance. But the older person might need a little bit longer because they might find that their cardiovascular system isn't as efficient or capable as the younger person's. The idea of a speed exercise is very cool or a power exercise is very cool because one of the big features that we see with older people is a suppression of their motor unit recruitment levels. Often, if you kind of test an older person, they've got lower levels of voluntary activation than a younger person. And a speed exercise is a really nice way of just trying to trigger an increase in motor unit recruitment. Now, we'll talk about other ways that that can be done. It doesn't have to be a speed exercise. Well, that's really an interesting possibility. Now, for people who are actually interested in working, specifically with older people, not just as a theoretical kind of thought experiment, it is worth mentioning that there is a whole set of the literature which is devoted to exploring the role of power training or speed training with older people, simply because old people do tend to display greatly reduced levels of maximum speed. So from a functional perspective, that might be interesting for certain kind of people working in that space. I'm less really interested in it per se. I'm not someone who's working in that area. I don't spend a lot of time reading about the challenges specifically faced by older people. And I think that, in all honesty, most people who are listening to this, who are either older or who are working with older people, are probably more likely to be working with masters athletes rather than necessarily, just general population older people. But in which case, the speed issue isn't really much of a factor because either you're already doing it because you're training for a sport that requires speed, or if you're training for a sport that doesn't require speed, then you probably won't really notice much of an issue on the speed side because you've already got pretty well developed other characteristics, which means that you're not really noticing much of a problem in day-to-day life from a functional point of view. Where the speed stuff really comes through is when you're kind of looking at studies of sedentary older people, and the researchers notice that a bit of speed work seems to dramatically affect their capabilities in day-to-day life. Well, if you're say a master's powerlifter or a master's, kind of, I don't know, what kind of sports masters athletes kind of tend to take part in these days. But if they tend to be more on the sort of the strength end of the spectrum, you're unlikely to notice deficits in your activities of daily life function because you're pretty functional, really. So that kind of speed stuff doesn't really kind of play into it. But that's
If you
just
have an
such
individual who continues to train throughout their training life and then just age as part of that, do we see significant reductions in speed as people age? Like, I'm assuming there'll
yes,
be some. Yeah. Is it?
massive, massive,
Yeah. Okay.
massive,
So
massive.
it's quite significant.
Yeah, no, it is. It is a really big deal. But the point I'm making is that you've got these two separate things to think about. Either you're a masters athlete who does need to move quickly. Let's say you're a masters throwing athlete, then your a lot of your attention will be devoted to try and figure out ways of mitigating that loss in speed, dealing with it, working around it, all of those kind of things. You will be obsessing over it quite a lot, but it's not going to have any impact on your day-to-day life really because you're already very, very functional. The other category of people is the people who are perhaps sedentary and old, and then you are going to see speed deficits playing a role in their day-to-day life. It's not going to be able to move out of the way of something if it falls over. They're not going to be able to move themselves around very easily and very quickly, get out of the way of something. So you will see a meaningful effect of speed training in that situation. But for the person who's aging but taking part in bodybuilding, for example, I just don't see that the speed issue would come up most of the time. You've got enough functionality just from the strength training sort of part of that.
This might be something you want to get into later. I'm not sure, but does the speed reduction, does that correlate fairly directly with reduction in like high threshold motor unit recruitment, or?
But obviously that will play a role, but I think it is definitely separate in other ways. I think you do see a reduction in muscle fiber shortening velocity that is independent of the motor unit recruitment reduction. One of my favorite things to do when people ask me this question is go and look at masters track athletes who've spent their life being track athletes. So they've got really high levels of recruitment, but when you see them run, it's like they're running through treacle. They just they can't move any faster than they are. They're really, really slow. Even though they've got high levels of recruitment, decent muscle mass, they're just moving slowly because of the factors that have negatively affected speed at a fiber level. So But I'm talking about 80-plus-year-old people at that point. I mean, that's what we classify as very old. Just briefly, in the literature, we tend to classify people as either 60 or 65 onwards as being old, and 80, 85 plus as being very old. That's just the kind of general kind of way that exercise science groups those ages of people.
Okay, so looking at this plan as a sort of whole plan in terms of the sets and the reps and all of that, apart from some of those exercise selection bits that you would perhaps change or, that you've identified are lacking, is there anything specific with the sets and the reps and the long rest periods and those sort of guides that you look at that you're like, oh, for an older person, I would definitely do that differently?
So exercise selection aside, no, I like the lower. Well, it's basically what I would classify as moderately heavy. I mean, so heavy would be 1 to 5, and then moderately heavy would be 6 to 10. I think moderately heavy is brilliant rep range for almost everybody. It's where I spend most of my time. I think it's hard to go really, really wrong with that, especially if you're using machine weights and single sets. Long rests. That's perfect for, again, will work for everybody, but I think it's, again, perfect for older people, as we'll explain as we go into the physiology side of things.
Let's jump in.
Okay, let's do it. So there's a number of different ways that you can start talking about the question of age in strength training. You can either start by talking about the differences in the recovery rates, or you can start talking about the differences in the adaptions and then bring in the discussion of recovery rates later on. Historically, when I've taught this, I've actually taught it recovery first, then adaptions. I'm actually going to try and switch that around today and see what happens. I'm really interested to see if this works better, because I think the assumption is, when I introduce this topic to people, the assumption is often that older people display reduced adaptions or a speed of adaptation. So like they grow more slowly, they display increases in strength more slowly, they display, all of the various adaptions more slowly in comparison with younger people. And it's kind of just this starting assumption that all of that is equally affected. And the really interesting thing is that it doesn't seem to look that way. So yes, if you go to this sort of hypertrophy side of the spectrum, you look at the hypertrophy literature, and you look at studies that have measured rate of growth in both older and younger people, then what you'll notice is that the rate of muscle mass increases and the rate of muscle fiber diameter increases in older people is slower, or are slower, than they are in younger people. Now, similarly, if you look at fascicle length increases, or you look at sarcomerogenesis in younger and older rodents, then again, what you'll find is that the rate of growth of both fascicle length and in humans and sarcomerogenesis, or sarcomeres in series in animals, is slower in older people than in younger people. And so you kind of like start to build up a picture and you go, oh yeah, okay, well, adaptions are, generally slower, at least as far as hypertrophy and sarcomerogenesis is concerned. But if you were to go outside of that immediately kind of, sort of obvious area of literature, and you were to start to go into areas like tendon stiffness changes and fiber type shifting and other adaptions that are not the mainstream ones that everyone's interested in, you would actually find that they don't behave in the same way. So one of my favorite studies shows that tendon stiffness in older people essentially tracks increases in younger people. It just goes on for a longer period of time. Why does it do that? Why do you carry on increasing tendon stiffness in older people for a longer time than you do in younger people? In young people, tendon stiffness kind of just reaches a plateau after a couple of months and just starts to, sit there. Older people, it carries on and just carries on increasing. Why? Because they started with much lower levels of tendon stiffness. So they're kind of carrying on to the point where they start to plateau later on, but fundamentally the rate of change is pretty much the same. You can get the same kind of data with fiber type shifting. You tend to find that the fiber type shifts drift more or less at the same speed in older people and younger people, and then start to plateau off as the kind of maximum amount of type 2X fibers has been converted into type 2A fibers. So ultimately, what's really, really interesting is that when we start talking about the effects of age on strength training adaptions, we can't just say that old people display slower adaptions across the board. It's one of, as people know, and I think this has started to catch on now, you can't just talk about outcomes and expect to, kind of get a sensible picture of what's going on if that outcome is an externally measured outcome that represents multiple internal adaptions. So you can't say old people increase strength more slowly than younger people and expect that to mean something. Okay, maybe it's true, but why is it happening? Do they increase recruitment at the same rate? Do they increase coordination at the same rate? Do they increase muscle size? It's like, what are all the factors that go into that? And are they all affected equally, or are they affected differently?
Well, especially in what you're saying here, a lot of this sounds like it's going to affect untrained older people more. like the tendon stiffness thing. Well, okay, if you've had an individual again train their whole life, they're not going to be starting at a level where the tendons are more compliant than they would have been otherwise.
Yeah, totally. So tendons and fiber type shifting are going to be factors that are mainly in that kind of category of things that untrained people are going to be affected by mostly. So yeah, but ultimately the point is that we're seeing a discrepancy between things that are kind of affected by age, definitely, and things that are much less affected by age. Now, that's kind of like my starting point, my observation that we've got these differences going on in terms of the rate of change of the individual adaptations that are underpinning things like strength gains. Now, one of the big questions then is why do hypertrophy and sarcomerigenesis display a slower rate of that in older people than in younger people? Now, just incidentally, before I answer that question, it's worth noting that if you look at fascicle length changes in older people over time, they are slower, but they still plateau at the same point. So if you kind of see a plateau happening in younger people at maybe 4, 5, 6 weeks or whatever, then the older people will take, say, 10, 12 weeks to plateau at the exact same location. So the fascicle length just takes longer to get there, but it still gets to the same point. It still plateaus in the same place, exactly as we would predict based on the kind of way that sarcomerigenesis works. But the question then is, well, why are we seeing such slow rate of adaptation in older people? Now, essentially, you've got two possibilities. Either there is a smaller sensitivity to the mechanical tension stimulus. So what you're saying there is that each workout that you do, the older person does 3 sets to failure, you do 3 sets to failure. Or actually, you do 3 sets to failure and I do 3 sets to failure. And that's a younger person and an older person. So, we both do the same workout, 3 sets to failure. And what you're saying, if you say the sensitivity of the stimulus is reduced in an older person, what you're saying there is that that person experiences a smaller adaptive response to that workout because of the inherent features of their muscle tissue. Right? That's one possibility. The alternative possibility is that the older person is carrying accumulated fatigue from the previous workout because they're not recovering in time between workouts. So you end up in the same place, but the mechanism by which you get to that result is different and it has different training implications. Yeah. So if you think that if the older person is experiencing less sensitivity, then your gut feel is going to be, okay, well, we need to give them a bigger stimulus. So people start to add more volume. Well, that's
Which I would say is
contrary.
a fairly typical piece of advice. That's something I've certainly heard a lot where, okay, if you have an older individual, basically you just add 1 to 2 sets per
You
exercise.
can find that in the literature. Oh yeah, there's review papers that have argued that point. Absolutely. But they're not starting from the question is like, is it genuinely definitively a lower stimulus sensitivity, or is it a reduced, kind of ability to recover from the previous workout, which means that you're suppressing your anabolic stimulus literally simply because you're carrying accumulated fatigue that you haven't got rid of. And I don't think there's been enough work to actually, I don't think there's been a recognition of that observation to start with. But, fundamentally, at the moment, I think most people are assuming that it's a sensitivity issue. Well, straight away, I'll be questioning that, saying, well, if it's a sensitivity issue, why don't I see it cropping up with fiber type shifting? Why don't I see it cropping up with tendon stiffness shifting? Okay, maybe you can rule tendons out because the tendon is not a muscle, but still fiber type shifting is not behaving the same way. So I think straight away, we've got to start asking the question is like, are we dealing with a sensitivity reduction issue or are we dealing with a recovery issue? That then brings us to the next point, which is to say, well, everybody knows that one of my favorite areas of literature in hypertrophy science is the maintenance studies. I just keep going back to them and going, look, they teach us so much cool stuff. Well, we actually have got a maintenance study in older people. So we've got a maintenance study in older men. And we were talking about it just before we came on the podcast, and we were looking at the ages of those subjects. I think it was like 70 to 75 years old. So properly in the middle of the old category between 60 and 80. And those guys were training for a period of time, doing 3 sets 3 times a week, and they increased muscle mass. And then they went to a maintenance where they did 3 sets once per week and they kept it. Now, this is super, super important because we know that 3 sets once a week is maintenance level in young people. If older people are less sensitive to the anabolic stimulus, then what we should see in the situation of maintenance is that they don't maintain on 3 sets. They should only maintain on 5 or maybe even 6. So the people who are saying, oh, no, we know that old people experience a smaller stimulus to a strength training workout. I'm like, well, okay, explain the maintenance literature then, because it shows me that the stimulus that the old person is getting is pretty much identical to the
Either the
stimulus.
stimulus is the same or they're not atrophying as quickly, which obviously would not Why,
not
why
make
would that happen?
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So straight away, you've got this data point which immediately pushes you away from the idea that you actually are experiencing a smaller stimulus per workout. So the idea then would be to say, well, okay, so the explanation for your reduced growth in older people is more likely to be reduced recovery between workout. And as soon as you start asking that question, the literature explodes in front of you because you've got loads of animal and human data showing that recovery rates are slower in older people, you know? And that then it's like, okay, so we know that's true. And we know that the maintenance literature is basically giving us the same answer in young people and old people. That strongly indicates that our issue regarding adaptions in older people is nothing to do with an inherently reduced sensitivity to a stimulus, and it's actually more about recovery. So now the idea of adding volume is ludicrous. You'd actually run away from that idea, go in the opposite direction, and lo and behold, that's exactly what the Silver Era was recommending. Literally what you started by telling us, like, do less. Okay, well, that's exactly what I'm seeing.
It'd be interesting if they were to do a study where even just once a week, but you had people, younger and older adults, do say 6 sets or 7 sets once a week, and then seeing what the hypertrophy stimulus was of that.
Yeah, so that would be kind of exploring whether there's a dose response per workout difference between older and younger people. I mean, we have got some nice data on frequency in rodents. They put older and younger rodents through the same kind of frequency volume combinations. And what they find is that in the younger rodents, they can recover and continue progressing. And the older rodents, once the volume is slightly too high, they immediately start to see the decrease in performance. They enter into this overreaching state, accumulated fatigue state.
So
So,
there could be a few moving parts then.
so I think it's mainly just that the older person is recovering more slowly from each workout rather than anything else.
Now, there isn't any concern over like measurements being different in terms of, do we know whether there's any difference in how, like, say, cell swelling between older people or younger people, or inflammatory response, or how long that timeline is for that inflammatory response to take place? Could that be influencing anything?
So before I answer that, I will I will answer that. Let me just quickly because this ties into the idea of what's actually happening in the post-workout recovery period. So, as everybody knows who's listened to any of these podcasts or read the FAQ, basically after you finish a strength training workout, you've got a period of time in which you've got calcium ion related fatigue mechanisms that essentially involve proteases damaging the tissue. And then secondly, you've got an inflammatory response off the back of that. And it's the inflammatory response really that seems to drive much of the secondary muscle damage effect and also the swelling associated with that. Now, yes, older people have a slightly dysregulated inflammatory process. So you might have a dysregulated muscle swelling occurring at the same time. That doesn't affect the maintenance literature, of course, because that
No, but
is
in terms of the other research suggesting that there was less hypertrophy, is
you
it
might have
possible?
less muscle swelling. Yes, you might, because you do tend to have a slightly reduced capability of a robust inflammatory response in the post-workout period. Absolutely. But yeah, in terms of the maintenance literature, that is not an issue because we're recovering in time for the weekly workout. But yeah, in terms of the other stuff, you might see a little bit of effect. The rat studies is not going to be affected by that because that's not really I mean, we're seeing some really dramatic changes in, for example, strength over time, where the older rats are just their strength levels are tanking, indicating that they're not recovering from one workout to the next. So you can kind of sort of see the wood for the trees, if you like, in that context. So the interesting thing about the older people and recovery situation is that, well, there's a few moving parts here, but basically, if you give like say for example, if you structure a workout to end up with kind of the same amount of post-workout fatigue immediately post-workout in the older group and the younger group, then you'll still find that the older group recover more slowly from that level of post-workout fatigue than the younger group. So you measured the same post-workout fatigue, but you just saw a slower recovery rate in the older group of people. And that's really interesting because that kind of tells you that it's not about older people being more susceptible to calcium ion related fatigue mechanisms, although, arguably there might be a little bit of that there. It's more about just the ability to deal with them once they've happened, which ties in with this idea of the inflammatory process being, dysregulated or less effective. So, that kind of is the broad picture. It's this idea that you might have the same post-workout fatigue, but it just takes you longer to deal with it. And that really means that you're not going to be able to do the same volume frequency combinations. You can't do probably this classic routine that we talk about, 3 sets 3 times a week or 3 sets every other day with moderately heavy loads, you're probably going to need to dial that back to 1 or 2 sets instead, which is exactly what your kind of silver era template was showing us at the beginning. The other moving parts really to be aware of is that there is a reduced voluntary activation level in older people. So generally speaking, so you kind of start off with this problem whereby you're not accessing as much high threshold motor units, you're not training as many muscle fibers. So potentially that could impact on the hypertrophy rate, but also it should reduce post-workout fatigue. So again, it's like if I do end up with the same amount of post-workout fatigue, does that mean that I've done something else that has created more of a muscle damaging effect in the fibers that I've got actually activated? Because if you're activating fewer fibers, you should see less post-workout fatigue, but I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing pretty much the same. So what is it that I'm doing, or what is it that I'm experiencing as an older person that causes that greater level of fiber level damage, for example, despite the fact that I'm activating fewer fibers? And one of the answers to that could be the reduction in dystrophin or costamers inside the muscle fibers. So I'm getting less protection from those costamers to the strains. And strains could give me two effects. It could give me greater stretch activated ion channel opening, so more calcium ion influx into those affected fibers. But it could also create a mechanical damage phenomenon. So obviously, people know that I think that the vast majority of damage post-workout is biochemical in nature, but as you lose dystrophin and your fibers become less capable of transmitting force laterally, you could start to get mechanical damage in those older people's muscle fibers. So one of the interesting things that could be done in the future is to actually look and see whether the muscle damage that older people experience has elements of what looks like maybe very mild muscle strain injury rather than actual muscle damage, because they're two very different characteristics. So there's a few things going on there which you kind of look at and go, well, is the older person experiencing something qualitatively different as well as quantitatively different?
Could there be an influence around susceptibility to supraspinal CNS fatigue? Like even if there was the same amount of damage, same amount of inflammation, could that affect an older person more?
Well, during a workout, obviously, supraspinal CNS fatigue is going to be mediated by the sensations that we experience. And this is where your program template with the longer rest periods was really interesting, because if the older person, for example, hasn't got as well a developed cardiovascular system, then they will be experiencing a lot of cardiovascular sensations when they exercise. That will create supraspinal CNS fatigue, and a longer rest period is going to be very helpful for avoiding that. In the post-workout period, it really just comes down to the inflammatory process and how it's functioning. I don't know whether or not the inflammatory system or the process that the older person experiences with that inflammatory process, are they going to experience a bigger or a smaller deficit in motor unit recruitment? I don't know. I think it's relatively difficult to parse that.
Yeah, so within the session, so obviously you mentioned from a cardiovascular standpoint, you're not familiar with anything else that would suggest a high susceptibility to within session supraspinal CNS fatigue?
So not really. I mean, again, it would come back to the inflammatory dysregulation. I mean, ultimately, inflammation determines not only the repair of the muscle tissue once you've exited the kind of the calpain process, but it also relates to how we feel, because the inflammation is constantly giving feedback to the brain. So yeah, I mean, if that inflammatory process is creating more supraspinal fatigue during the workout, then yeah, you would see a suppression of motor unit recruitment from that purpose as well, which would then mean that you would see a bigger exercise order effect, which would then tie into what you could get that from the cardiovascular system as well. I mean, it doesn't have to be inflammation. For both the cardiovascular and the inflammatory processes during a workout, you will see an impact on supraspinal CNS fatigue from those two things. So in the event that the older person is finding the cardiovascular demand more challenging than the younger person, you'll see an exercise order effect that's bigger. So you'll find that your last few exercises of the workout are pretty much junk, ties in perfectly with your template. Again, you get the same thing if the inflammatory process is also communicating more negative sensations, you'll also see the same problem. So whether it comes from inflammation or whether it comes from the cardiovascular system, you are going to still see supraspinal fatigue that's bigger during the workout. Whether it happens to a greater extent or a lesser extent in the post-workout period really depends on what the inflammation process is doing. And I just don't know whether that changes meaningfully or which direction it changes in an older person. I just don't know that.
And in terms of tolerable perception of effort, anything to suggest that would differ?
I don't know. This is now getting into like territory, because my expertise extends to understanding how strength training works, you kind of, as you start to push into different populations to understand how strength training works in different populations, you kind of understand different characteristics of their responsiveness, for example. But obviously, there are still also factors associated with simply being old that I'm not aware of, you know. So I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other stuff that old people experience that, I'm just not aware of that might impact on strength training. I just haven't, come across that yet. And as we were saying before the podcast, at some point I'm just going to have to go through the physiology of old people and, get to the bottom of everything that is relevant. But at the moment, I don't know whether there are specific perception of effort issues that older people kind of face. My gut feel is that the model will still apply. It's just what you're looking for is something that is there. If you just, yeah, if you just feel tired for some other reason, or if you feel, this discomfort, pain, or any other sensation that is there for any other reason, it will impact on your maximum tolerable perception of effort, because it'll bring you closer to it. So
I was saying,
any
I was like, I wonder if there's just a perception of effort just by virtue of being old. I wonder if you just, like you said,
Well,
have niggles.
it would have to be mediated by
Yeah.
a feeling,
Yeah, yeah, but if you're feeling fatigued and like if your base level
Exactly,
of energy is lower, you got some muscle aches and
exactly.
joint
Yeah,
niggles.
yes. But that would all be probably mediated by, in many cases, an inflammatory process. We have an inflammatory process that makes us, the brain detects that, makes us feel more tired, fatigued. So, yeah, anything like that is probably going to cause those kind of issues. It's like an injury in many ways. Yeah, basically what we've done then is we've walked through how adaptations are different in older people compared to younger people. We've explained how that then translates to recovery as the explanation for why those adaptations tend to be slower. And we've also, as we've gone along, tied this back to the program template that you explained at the beginning. So let me just go back to that, or a program, and explain what I think that means for training the older person. So if we are accepting that recovery being slower is the primary issue, but also we're aware that we're likely to see a reduced exercise capacity during a workout and also reduced motor unit recruitment during a workout, we've got a number of things to tackle here that we want to kind of wrap up together into a workout template. We also want to just be aware that we might see a bit more mechanical damage in the form of tiny micro strains of the muscle fibers because of the loss of dystrophin and the reduced costameric content.
You want to just briefly touch on that for a moment longer, just why that might then influence, like what's the significance of that? Because there's something there that's important and people may not know.
Sure. So basically, the way muscle strain injuries happen is by repeated micro strains over time, bringing the failure length of a muscle fiber below physiological range of motion. So in normal muscle, undamaged muscle, damage is not the right word in this context, but in unaffected, previously unstrained muscle fibers, the maximum strain length of a muscle fiber is longer than your physiological range of motion. So essentially, it's physically impossible to cause the muscle fiber to rupture because its straining length, its damage ripping length is longer than you can actually move your joint through. So it's like a physical impossibility. What happens over time, if you repeatedly create very small microstrains by moving that muscle fiber to a very extreme length repeatedly, you can, and then not recovering from that, you can create a failure length that is inside of your physiological range of motion, at which point you can then tear a muscle if you have enough fibers experiencing that problem. So just briefly, if you've, like, for example, there's a tendency on various social media platforms to post videos of people experiencing muscle strain injury, which is, I think, pretty poor taste, but people do it. And everyone analyzes why is it that happened, and they're all kind of looking at the exercise, or they're looking at the running pattern of the athlete on the pitch. If you see someone like a soccer player experience a hamstring strain injury, everyone's then like playing armchair quarterback, trying to draw lines or trying to figure out, oh, he was doing this at that point and that's why. And it's like, no, rubbish. What happened was, previous to that point in time, the activities that athlete was engaged in were creating very small strains of the muscle fibers, which were starting to rip costamers off the fiber. That's what happens. So the strain of the fiber starts to tear away the costamers, and then the fiber becomes much more tearable at a shorter length. And eventually, when you get inside of the physiological range of motion, you can tear the muscle fiber at any length. well, not any length, but a reasonably long length within your normal physiological range of motion. And it's all about the process of micro straining of the fiber that tears costamers off it, and as a result makes the fiber easy to tear at a shorter maximum length. Now, older
As you
people
talk through
naturally
that, it
have
makes
that
me
feature.
wonder, when you have enhanced athletes, obviously there's issues around connective tissue with enhanced athletes anyway, but it does make me wonder, is part of where we see more muscle injuries, is that potentially because these athletes tend to be doing a lot more volume and then tend to be accumulating some of this damage? Maybe it's got nothing actually to do with the gear itself, and maybe it's to do with the training methods.
So it might be that the anabolics are creating an increase in muscle fiber size without costamers attaching to any new sarcomeres. But I don't know. I mean, ultimately, it seems to be the loss of costamers, the tearing away of costamers, that exposes the fiber to more damage in the future in the form of mechanical damage. And as I say, old muscle tends to have fewer costamers in it. So as a result, you could get to a situation where you're more susceptible to that kind of damage, in that group of people. But equally, when you have fewer costamers, you're also going to get more stretch and strain of the sarcomeres anyway, which is going to translate to more calcium ion-related fatigue as well. So you kind of get both things. Not only do you get the potential for mechanical damage, which is analogous to a strain injury on a kind of a tiny level, but you also get the normal kind of damage that we all get from doing strength training anyway, which is the biochemical stuff. So yeah, we're kind of looking at a training program. We're saying, look, we need to minimize the amount of within session supraspinal CNS fatigue, and we want to minimize the resulting post-workout fatigue as well. Now, the interesting thing is there that, they're not necessarily the same set of factors that we would, kind of choose to minimize both things. So you have to actually treat them separately. But at the same time, you're also looking to try and increase motor unit recruitment levels to try and access more muscle fibers and create more of a stimulus across the whole muscle. So you kind of got multiple things that you're trying to do. So within the session, obviously, if you're just dealing with supraspinal CNS fatigue, you'd be saying, well, there's no point in doing a lot of sets. I want to keep my volume relatively low. I also want to keep my rep range relatively, low and use heavier loads, moderately heavy loads. Probably want to just leave a rep in reserve here or there to avoid that, kind of not only within workout, but now this ties into them post-workout as well. And to be fair, the volume stuff is going to tie into post-workout, but ultimately keeping volume relatively low, leaving reps in reserve, using heavier loads, that is going to help supraspinal fatigue. It's also largely going to help post-workout fatigue as well. We're also going to be really careful about stretch position exercises because, again, that's where you're probably going to get all your damage from. Potentially, we're going to get a little bit of mechanical damage from if that is going to be an issue with the low levels of dystrophin. So the workout plan starts to look very much like something that I would do.
I know, I was thinking that actually when we were preparing for this episode. I was like, "Oh, this is gonna
It
be
really
totally in your
does
wheelhouse."
looks like my kind of program. It's like it's just doing sort of, not actually that many exercises per session, maybe, full body, but maybe only 8 exercises, and actually full body AB and alternating between more contract and more stretch position exercises. And people go, "Oh, no, you're not getting the maximum benefit from that." No, I know I'm not, but I'm only doing my stretch position exercises 1.5 times a week, which is actually a great benefit because I get a lot less muscle damage and I'm running lower risk of these kind of this potential for micro strains, creating you know, a loss of costamers. So I think it's not massively dissimilar from how I would program Gen Pop. It just slightly fewer exercises, longer rest periods, a little bit less kind of focus on maximizing hypertrophy and a little bit more focus on minimizing muscle damage across the week.
I mean, it's all the same things that we would normally consider anyway.
Yeah, totally. It's
You're
just
just kind of being a
the
little bit
balance is
more
tipped
conscious.
a bit further away from optimizing stimulus
Yeah.
and a little bit more towards avoiding excessive post-workout damage, and also just taking a bit more care in the workout itself to keep rest periods longer, avoid doing excessive volume or proximity to failure or anything like that. But of course, equally, something that would not be in my program because it just isn't necessary would be, something that is like designed to increase recruitment. Now, in the template that you explained, this was a speed movement. I actually prefer isometrics. I think that is a much more elegant, safe, and easy way of doing it. for most people most of the time. As I say, it just doesn't feature in my programming because of my athletic background. It's just not needed. But for people who are perhaps, coming into strength training later in life, I definitely think that it makes a lot of sense.
Do you know what would be an interesting idea here? And I don't know if this would work, but I think it would be fairly close. Would be you mentioned having lengthened position exercises on one of those two workouts, and I think that's
Yeah.
something that for some muscles I'm conscious about that when I'm programming. But I think in all honesty, I feel like a lot of people are able to recover from some lengthened positions within 2 days usually. But this is a situation where you'd be more conscious of it. But given the benefit of the isometrics here, potentially having like an isometric focused workout on one of those days where you're using more shortened positions, and then having that lengthened position day on the other workout. So you're getting the motor unit recruitment benefits from the isometrics, you're reducing damage, but you're not sort of impeding that recoverability within that next 48-hour period. That could be an interesting template to play with.
Yeah. I think that would probably require a specific mindset because, a lot of the time within the context of talking about all this stuff, we have to recognize that people are still people and it really helps them to see progressive overload happening over time. That's why I really love isometrics for the motor unit recruitment benefits. But unless you've got a load cell that tells you what the number is when you're doing the isometric, I'm not a fan of them for strength training programming because they don't tell you that you're making any progress. So I really like the physiological side of it. And so I would do it just as a warm up. I would be like, let's do 2 or 3 isometrics, different ones. And remember, if your goal is to increase recruitment with an isometric, you don't need to worry about frequency. This is the thing that people kind of sort of paint me as the frequency guy. But the reality is, it's only frequency if it's an adaptation that, disappears by the time you've got home from the gym. If
And
it's an
that also
adaptation,
doesn't mean that you can't be achieving multiple adaptions with that thing, right?
not at all. No, you can, absolutely. But in the model that I would start with, my template for older people would not be using isometrics for hypertrophy. I would use it just for the motor unit recruitment benefits. And there's actually a subtlety there that I think is worth drawing out because if you start to use isometrics, this is the same idea as I talked about this a long time ago. If you go to the gym and you've traditionally been doing 3 sets of an exercise, and I ask you instead for the next 2 weeks to only do single sets, I guarantee you will blow your numbers out the water because people go to the gym and they do 3 sets. And even though they're trained to failure on the first set, it's not. Well, it is and it isn't. Technically it is, as I've always said, failure is task failure when you reach task failure, but it's not the number of reps that you could do if I said only do 1 set, don't do 3.
And that's absolutely true. And I see that like literally all the time in my groups, all the time. I see it with myself when I started doing single sets or so. And that's as someone who I
That was the
love
thing that
training.
tipped me over the edge, actually. 'Cause when I actually found that it was me that it affected as well as other people, I was like, okay, this is real.
100%. That's it. Yeah. Because I would always take sets to failure, multiple sets. I would take every set to failure. And then suddenly I'm
Yeah.
doing single sets and I'm seeing my numbers like I'm
To
almost
jump
double
by
checking my
1 or 2
numbers.
reps.
Yep.
Yeah, they jump up
Yep.
by 1 or 2 reps.
Now,
Literally,
what
if
something people
people
need to,
listening to us don't believe us, right, just try it. If you've
yeah.
been doing like 3 sets, 4 sets, 5 sets, whatever for an exercise, next time you go in, just do 1 and try and like just annihilate your first set numbers that you would normally get. Absolutely guarantee that unless you are really, really good at a particular exercise, the chances are you will absolutely annihilate your numbers. It's just absolutely remarkable how big the effect is. But I
One
think
thing
the
I think
same thing
people should know
applies.
with that though is that progress does not stay consistently. Because sometimes I'll get people contact me and they'll be like, "Oh, I was progressing so well. I started doing single set first few weeks, like numbers were, blowing out of the water, and now I've hit a wall." It's like, no, no. What's happened now is this is like ultimately your true rate of progression and muscle
Correct.
growth, and you need to adjust that expectation. And I think at some point we need to do a podcast on this about, I guess, rate of progression or progressive methods or stuff like that. One of the biggest mistakes I see people making is having, when they start doing what I would say is an intelligently designed program, where they're not changing exercises all the time, they've actually got high frequency of exercises, they quote unquote hit a wall within, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and they think they're not progressing because they're used to progressing so much quicker because of these neural adaptations and things that are not true muscle growth in the past.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, absolutely. No, when things start to grind to a halt, that's a great sign. That's the indication that you are now only achieving hypertrophy driven progressive overload, really, or mostly hypertrophy. But I argue that the same thing is applicable to the isometric training situation. So if you want to use the isometric trigger an increase in motor unit recruitment, use it for that purpose. Because if you try and use it for hypertrophy purposes, your first set will not be a maximum effort anymore. Not in a true maximum recruitment sense. So if you just got one max effort isometric to do, then yeah, you'll probably give it a really good shot of triggering an increase in recruitment. If I give you 3-5 sets of isometrics to do, bang, the number of motor units that you're recruiting then comes flying back down. Yes, it works for hypertrophy. It probably doesn't work that well for increasing recruitment anymore. So given that my purpose for using those would always be a recruitment stimulus, I don't like also using them for hypertrophy in the context of the same workout. I would always kind of treat those two things separately. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting point. And presumably then in that situation where you are using it for motor unit recruitment, then you could also employ an internal focus of attention as well.
Yeah, you could. You could, because, that would really send activation to the location that you're kind of, trying to activate and trigger the adaptation more effectively. I'm hesitating because when I do them, it kind of feels like a life or death experience.
Yeah, I think it'll be exercise dependent. I'm thinking because sometimes I do it for bicep curls, and that would be a situation where that would work quite well. But I can understand there might be some exercises where maybe it wouldn't work as well.
Yeah. I mean, like when I do it, when I'm trying to pull something apart, it doesn't feel like my brain has the ability to activate the muscle deliberately. It feels like it's trying to pull the thing apart that I'm trying to pull apart. It tends to be quite task focused, which is external. But, you know, yeah, I mean, I think there are muscles, especially single joint stuff. I think when you try and pull something apart or push something, the brain naturally tends to tilt towards goal orientated behaviors, just maybe out of habit. But with single muscle, yeah, I think you probably could do that. Absolutely.
So if someone were to use isometrics, a single set, let's say a 5 to 10 second, that would be enough to see those motor unit recruitment
I would
benefits.
probably even keep it to 5, really. I would say keep it to 5. I mean, I notice a drop off between 3 and 5 actually. So I think a lot of people with athletic experience do tend to peak earlier in the sort of the 3 to 5 second zone. I get an extremely negative sensation if I try and hold more than 4 or 5 seconds. I start to dial back on my recruitment levels because my perceptions of effort coming from other stuff is starting to rise. So I would say that if you're trying to increase recruitment, err on the shorter side of an isometric rather than the longer side.
And that's enough to see an increase there because, again,
Yeah,
sometimes I
that's the
hear people
stimulus.
say these things like, obviously, if we look at this stimulating reps model, we might assume that someone might need, 3 or 4 or 5 stimulating reps to see hypertrophy, but things like motor unit recruitment is not the same. You don't need
No, it's not.
multiple bouts to get that adaptation. You just kind of need it in that one moment in time.
You need to hit your threshold. That's it.
Yeah.
And that's the cool thing about it. You really don't need to go mad at all with the amount of repetitions. You can just focus on the quality
And like you said before, you could actually rotate that. So you could do a couple, maybe 2 exercises, 1 exercise, whatever you
because it's
wanted.
not lost. Exactly. Because there's no frequency issue here. So you can literally you could literally say, I'm going to do a bit of hamstring kind of isometrics this week. I'll do some quads the following week. I'll do some calves, do some biceps, triceps. You could literally spend 3 months rotating through different exercises if you wanted to, and then just start again. You don't have to do these things all the time because it's not a adaptation that detrains, not really. So honestly, I wouldn't. And actually, from my experience, because I have done some of this stuff, and I know if you do it properly, it's actually mentally quite tiring. You wouldn't want to do a lot of it. Maybe this I know that there's some TikTok kids doing some crazy stuff with this, but for me, and I regard myself as a reasonably better template for older people than they might be doing. I wouldn't want to say to the old person, "Oh, we're going to do a max effort isometric for every single muscle of the body, and then we're going to do a normal strict." No, don't do that.
Mm.
It's not necessary because you don't need to, kind of do every single muscle all the time because you don't have that frequency problem. And similarly, it's just going to prejudice the rest of the training session because it's just going to end up being a training session in and of itself, but one that doesn't really get you the hypertrophy that you want. So I would just pick 1 or 2 isometrics each workout and just rotate them. I wouldn't go crazy with lots and lots of isometrics in this situation. Okay, fine. I'm not, and I've said before, when people pick up the physiology that I've explained and start to go in interesting directions, I'm all for that. I support them. Fantastic. I know that other people think that some of the things that are coming out of the TikTok scene are absolutely crazy, but the point is that they're at least starting from physiology and trying to explore different directions and what they can do. That's creative, that's exciting, that's interesting, and I'm all for that. But just in the context of what we're talking about today, which is how would you kind of construct a training program for muscle mass increases in older people, I think that I would limit the amount of max effort isometrics that I did to probably 1 or 2 per training session.
Are there any other methods you think would be beneficial here? Like one thing I'm thinking here would be, given more susceptibility to within session supraspinal CNS fatigue, given the lower motor unit recruitment, potentially more single joint stuff, or maybe machine exercises or exercises where people are using small amounts of muscle mass, or even unilateral exercises, potentially they could have benefit.
So all the normal rules apply, absolutely. So everything applies as we would normally do it. The issue is, of course, that when you start doing single joint, single limb, anything like that, you're now incorporating the requirement for more exercises in totality. So the reality is I would probably want to just try and find an equilibrium point. And I would probably personally, on the machine exercises to obviously maximize the stability problems, but I would probably err on the multi-joint stuff, just because I don't want to give an old person a list of exercises, sort of this long. I'd rather give them a more condensed list that covers all the bases. And okay, there's some compromises there, but at the end of the day, we get them in and out of the gym in a sensible period of time. So even though you're absolutely right, the single joint, single limb stuff would give you the recruitment benefits, I think you would start to see the tail off towards the end of the workout with just the volume of stuff that you were trying to cram in.
One
And
thing
again,
I
my experience personally is that works better for me as well.
One thing I use occasionally in my programming is, and a lot of people again think I'm making a mistake here from a frequency standpoint, but I might program a unilateral exercise on workout, and then the next workout I might give a different unilateral exercise and do that one bilaterally. And so yes, there's going to be some muscle fibers that might not be recruited in that bilateral version, but I'm using that unilateral for some of that motor unit recruitment as well. So that potentially could be one way of doing it, where maybe every other workout A, you might do one exercise unilaterally, and then on the other one you might do a different one unilaterally. There could be some creative ways people could do some of that.
Totally. And you're kind of doing the isometrics job
Yeah,
for it, really.
exactly. Using
Taking that
unilateral
out.
instead of isometrics. Exactly.
Yeah. So you end up in about the same number of things that you're getting done, and you've just done it in a slightly different way.
Yeah. Yeah. And some people may find isometrics more enjoyable or unilateral training more enjoyable. Like I know, I've got some clients where I'm never going to give them isometrics because I did it once and they hated it. So I'm not
Yeah,
gonna do
I'm in that category. It affects me mentally. I literally feel like I'm going to rip part of my body off. That's kind of what I experience when I do an isometric. It's quite mentally demanding for me. I mean, I've
And
done
then you've
it and
got
I
the
do it.
opposite though, because I remember when I used to be in the gym, I'd have clients who I'd give them isometrics. I just knew that they were not applying themselves because they didn't enjoy it, so they wouldn't. And so you've got people on both ends of the fence where it's destroying your soul, and then other people where they just want to
It's
work hard
destroying
with
my
it.
soul, but it definitely feels pretty life or death when I do it. But the issue is it's about matching the strategy to the person. I think there's a number of ways of getting to the same answer. It's just what suits the person in their scenario. But the point is to try and drive recruitment levels up, because in the older population they do tend to be quite suppressed. And that then means that we've got to, but incidentally, and this ties into, perhaps we can, raise this topic, because I get this question a lot, which is, if an older person has spent their life doing strength training, how does that then change how they respond to a strength training person? Are they just like a younger person, or are they just like an older person who's untrained, or are they something completely different entirely? Well, stick around and I'll tell you, because I'm in that category. So if you just keep listening to this podcast over the next 5 years, you'll find out, because I'm a hell of a lot older than I actually look. So there's some interesting, kind of possibilities there. But anyway, the thing that I think we can say at the moment is that obviously the older person who is a lifetime strength training kind of participant, they're sort of unlikely to have the motor unit recruitment deficits that a sedentary older person would have, at least, perhaps until they get to very old territory. So for most of their kind of 60s, maybe 70s, they're likely to still have pretty high levels of recruitment, in my opinion. But I don't think they're going to get around the slower recovery rates problem. I think that the slow recovery problem is probably something that is age specific, not training history specific. So I think actually, if you were to, and I'm maybe leaning too hard into my own personal experience here, but I think you'll probably find that the group of people who are old but also lifetime strength trained are probably going to be the most susceptible to the muscle damage problem that you can find. I think that group of people is going to be people who have high recruitment but also all of the same recovery problems that the older person has. Now, some of it will be tapered by the fact that they'll have a ton of costomeres already in place, and that does protect them to a certain extent. But I think that the suppressed inflammation response or the dysregulated inflammation response, coupled with the high level of recruitment, is probably going to give you the worst of both worlds. Not trying to, kind of be too much of a doomer, but I do think that, a lot of people go, oh, well, no, I won't have the problem of aging with strength training because I've trained my whole life. I'm like, I actually think you're going to have the bigger problem because you're going to have better access to high threshold motor units, but you're going to have all the problems of dysregulated inflammation that old people normally have anyway. And that certainly plays into my experience, which is that my recovery is just tanked since I kind of got into that sort of, well, within shouting distance of that particular milestone.
So maybe let's conclude with this. Someone, because we've kind of given a template there for someone who maybe is older coming into strength training. So let's say you have an individual who is getting to that age where they're feeling like they're not performing as well as they were, they're not recovering as well as they were. So what might they look at adjusting, not compromise their kind of, I guess, results moving forwards? Obviously, I guess it's sort of just incrementally making some of the changes we've talked about so far. But, one thing might be that, hey, maybe you don't need to jump down to a single set immediately. If you're used to doing 3 sets every other day, maybe you just jump down to 2 sets and you see
Totally,
if your performance increases and recovery increases from that. Or,
totally.
maybe it's reducing repetitions 1 or 2 per set, or keeping 1 more repetition in reserve. Or, my personal, like my one-on-one clients, I don't have that many older clients, but sometimes I have some, kind of getting to that maybe 60, 65 mark. And generally what I'll do with them is just add 1 extra recovery day between those sessions. So instead of 2 rest days, we're just going to add a 3rd rest day. And maybe I'll try, first of all, reducing down a set, but if that doesn't do the job, then I'm just going to push those workouts out 1 extra day. Those would be kind of some of the tools, I guess, people could look at using. Is there anything else you would add to that?
No, you're exactly right. I think really it's a matter of starting with a template that you've developed over your life that you're happy with, and then gradually just very slowly dialing back a little bit of volume, a little bit of proximity to failure. So you might take a set off here or there, take a rep off at your normal, like sort of reps in reserve, do a little bit further away from failure. And then eventually you're going to find that you have to start messing with frequency as well. So you might have to go from, as you're saying, training every other day to training 3 times a week or training 2.5 times a week or whatever it is. You start to mess around with that. Maybe even you end up with twice a week. I think that you can, unless you are really, really kind of a genetic outlier, you're probably always going to be able to train twice a week with the kind of full body, single sets, a rep in reserve. Don't think you're going to get to a point where that becomes impossible to recover
Not
from.
personally had any clients where that's not been achievable.
Yeah, I mean, the older I get, the more extreme I seem to think my physiology is. I think I'm really very much up against it in terms of recovery capacities. And I'm still fine 3 times a week, single sets, even to failure. But I think that I probably will gradually start to have to leave a rep in reserve here or there, maybe start to move towards strategies like, or even, like sort of full body AB. You are moving the damage around a bit, giving yourself a bit more recovery capacity. So that, I really like that. That immediately takes all the pressure off me if I do that. But I can see a scenario within 5 to 10 years, I will be training twice a week. I don't think I'll be able to train 3 times a week forever. I just don't respond like that. Recovery is an issue for me. But yeah, I think gradually just about identifying specific factors in the workout that are creating post-workout fatigue and just figuring out the least bad option in any given moment. So for me, yeah, volume would be the first thing that I reduced. Then it would be proximity to failure. And then it would be maybe like exercise selection. And then finally it would be frequency. I really would punt frequency as far as possible, because as soon as you start reducing frequency, you've got all kinds of other issues to deal with.
Okay, hopefully for all of our 65 to 80-year-old listeners, that was an enjoyable podcast to hear that we have a large
Everybody's got to
audience.
get old.
This is
Everybody's got
true.
to get
Yeah,
old.
just bookmark this, save it
It's
for the next few
relevant for
decades.
everybody.
Anyway, guys, hopefully that was, I mean, especially for coaches, a lot of people listening to this are coaches. There are people working with older lifters and older clients. So hopefully that was helpful for you guys. Otherwise, like you said, if not, bookmark it, save it for when you do get old. Thank you guys for joining us, and I hope you'll join us again next week.